We're going to be taking a closer look at JSON and JSON data and how we can use that within JavaScript. So connecting to a JSON file, retrieving the information from the JSON file, and then outputting it within our web page. Also how we can use the different JSON methods in JavaScript, such as parse and stringify, in order to convert a JavaScript object into a string or convert a string into a JavaScript object. Let's look at JavaScript Object Notation, or the short form is JSON. So this is a lightweight data interchange format that is easy to read by humans. Here's an example of a JSON file, and as we can see, it's relatively easy to read what the values are that are contained within there. It's broken out nice and neatly, and it's on separate lines, so it's easy to read. So it's a subset of the JavaScript Programming Language, and JSON is a text format that is completely language independent. So just because it's a JSON file doesn't mean you have to use JavaScript. You can use other familiar programming languages, the C family of languages, including C, C++, C#, Java, JavaScript, Perl, Python, and many others. These properties make JSON the ideal interchange value. And as you can see, once again, it's really easy to work with the JSON data. So we can have string values, we can have numbers, we can have objects, we can have arrays, and any combination of those in order to hold the data. So let's go ahead and we're going to connect to some of the data that we have within an object format and open up the JavaScript file. So first, what we want to do is we want to set the URL. And because this is going to be a local file, we're just going to call it my1JSON. So this is the link to where I've got the local file. And then let's create a function and get JSON data. And this is going to be a function that we're going to use in order to get the JSON data. And then within here, we need to have fetch. And fetch is the newer method in order to make the requests. So we specify the URL. By default, it's going to use the get method. And then we chain together waiting for a response on it. And once this response is received, we can actually have several different options for returning back the response value. So we can return it back as regular text. So return that as regular text value. Or if we know that the endpoint is going to be JSON, we can return it back as JSON as well. So this is going to retrieve back the data. And then moving it onto the next promise, this is where we can make use of the data. So return back as data. And right now, for now, what we'll do is we'll output it into the console log. So we're going to output the result of the returned data into the console log. In addition, let's add in a catch. So if for whatever reason we don't have the right URL or we throw an error, we have a way to catch that error. And we can log that out into the console. So we can just log it out as, let's actually log it out as a console error. And here we can just indicate that an error has occurred and then provide some of the error details. And this is coming directly from the fetch request if there's some issues with the data. So let's go ahead and we're going to run the get JSON data. So it doesn't have a return back on this function, but we do have a value there where we're connecting to the data and then we're accessing the address. And this is all coming from the file. Also, really easy to access this information. And all of the different JSON objects, they're going to be connected in multiple different ways. So you need to be able to access the data accurately. And the data is only ready once the response has completed. So this is where if we wanted to output it onto the page, I've got an element called with a class of output. So let's output some content into there and connect to that element using the document. And let's use the query selector. Select the element with a class of output. So this will select that particular element. And then we'll set it up on a click event. So right now we'll just write data there so that we can see it, it's visible on the page. And then let's add in an add event listener to it. So we'll listen for a click. And once the click gets run, then we're going to invoke the function get JSON data. So you click it, and we'll make a request, get the JSON data. So there's our JSON data. And in order to output it, let's create another function to handle output. And I'll just call it make output. And we'll pull in some data that's going to be passed in as one of the arguments. So that way, once we have the data ready, then we can update the output within the fetch object. And right now, for now, what we'll do is we'll update the output and inner HTML, or we can set the text content of it, and it'll just say loading. So once it completes loading, so we click it, it goes to loading. Once it completes loading, it's going to run the myOutput function, and then this is where we can parse through the data and make use of the return data. So let's output some of the content from the data and set up a variable. We can call it, we'll just set it up as let and call it as HTML. So this is where we can build the HTML, and then we'll take the output and update the inner HTML with whatever the HTML is that we've built. So first, let's look at the data that we have. So within the first level, we've got a value for name. So let's select that, and I'm using the template literals, so I can use the curly brackets and the $sign in order to return back the result. So we click it, and we get the result there. So let's actually construct an HTML. So setting it up as an H1. And of course, you can format it however it makes sense for you. So there's our H1. And what else do we want to get? Maybe we want to get the address. So this is going to be a little bit more of a complex value. So we have an option with template literals. We can either go to a new line, or we could just add to the HTML. So let's do it this way. There's a number of different ways to output the content, of course, into the HTML. You can also create the page elements. So we'll create a div, and then within the div, we're going to use the data. And this time we need to go down into the object. So selecting the address. And then within the address, we've got a number of properties here. So we've got a value for street. And we also have a value for city. So let's just create these. And the reason I'm doing it like this, it's a little bit more readable. And with the template literals, we do have the option to do multiple lines. There's a city, state, and then the phone numbers are going to be as an array. So we'll loop through the array values and we'll output those below as well. So let's see what we have so far. We click it. There's our output that we're generating. And then let's loop through. So we've got an object called data phone numbers, which is going to be an array. And of course, you do need to have an array in order to loop through it. So using the for each, and then we can make use of each element there as we're constructing it. And this is where we're just going to append to the HTML. So adding to the HTML using the backticks once again. And let's set this up as a div. Or actually, we'll do it as small. And then here, we've got the element. And within the element, because it's going to be referencing that phone numbers item, we have a type and a number. So select the type, and then let's add in the number after here. So all on the same line. And this is going to be element number. So save it once again. We'll see what that looks like. So that gives us the values there, and we can also add in a separate line break if we want. So that will give us the numbers on separate lines. And that just basically constructs the HTML that we have. And this is also dynamic. So if we were to add in additional phone numbers, so if we had another work number, we'll just call it work2 and make it slightly different. Now when we request that data, that's going to dynamically update there. So as long as we understand the structure of our JSON file, it's relatively easy in order to output that JSON file. Let's also look at how we can output JSON data. So if we want to output the entire data as JSON, we can do that as well. So selecting the HTML. And this is going to output the value of the data JSON file as a string value. So we can do, if we output it just as data, it's just going to return it back within this where it just says object. So we don't want that. We want to output the object results. So this is where we can use the JSON method, which allows us a method in order to stringify and parse. So we can convert JSON between JavaScript objects and strings. So if we want to stringify data, so that will return back the string representation of the data. And we can also, if we want to as well, we can take the stringified data, and that's a representation of the data as a string. So if we were to console log out the data string, it comes back into the console, the dev console, as just regular black text. So we can't now use data st and get name. It's going to throw an error on that. So in order to make it into a usable object, we need to take the stringified data, and we can use JSON parse in order to take the stringified value. So if your JSON is being returned back as stringified JSON, then you can convert it, you can parse it either into a usable JavaScript object, or if you want it as a string value, if you only have one option to save a string, such as a local variable, then you can convert the JSON object into a string and then convert it back into a usable JavaScript object. So right now it's a JavaScript object, so you can select it and we could do data object, and we could go down the different property values. We've got address, name, age, and phone numbers. So that way we can select that data. So in summary, JSON is a lightweight interchange format that is easy for humans to read, and it's easy for machines to parse and generate. So it's really easy format to work with when you've got sets of data that you want to use within your programming code. It's a basic subset of a JavaScript object. So that's what works really nice and neatly with JavaScript. And when we've got it within a JavaScript object, we can build and use all of the built-in methods, such as the methods that we were using here, where JavaScript provides us some methods to work with JSON, where we can convert JSON into a string or into a JavaScript object. And once it's within a JavaScript object, that gives us the access to different methods that are available within JavaScript.